And on that note, I'm now going to take about 10 minutes before we bring on our guest to set up the whole context here. I had a really good long talk with him yesterday, and then we had a great group discussion. I think this is the most we've ever prepped for a guest, by the way, Chapman, not to put any pressure on you, but everybody's watched the video. We discussed it yesterday. I talked with you, and the result is going to be a really great discussion here. So to dive into, here's Chapman. Last year, I had our buddy Park Howell, who you got to know in the last session. He's the host of his podcast, The Business of Story, and had Chapman on as a guest to talk about producing show segments for HBO Real Sports. And here's our overall context. So you're welcome to ask this question. Why in the world are you bringing this guy in from a TV sports show? What's the relevance? Here's your starting relevance is what we've been through a bunch of times already. This fundamental divide between your audiences at the simplest of all levels. And a lot of the stuff I present to you in the form of my complaints against the science communication world, because so many people talk about you need to know your audience, but they don't give you an analytical way to approach it. That's what this is. So all else equal, we've got two main audiences. You got your inner group, people that know your topic and they don't need a lot of explanation. Then you've got the outer group. So, and what matches with those is the, and Chapman, if you can hold off for a few minutes, I'm going to be going through a bunch of setup stuff here.
No problem.
Okay, cool. So, as we know, with the inner group, you get the luxury of you don't have to worry about this narrative stuff. They already know it, and they're all your friends at the bar, and everything you talk about, they find interesting and fascinating. People love to hang out with their inner group because it's so easy. It doesn't take this effort. But how big is your inner group? And that's the question. It turns out it's usually pretty small. It's the outer group that you're mostly, and furthermore, for environmentalists, they're constantly saying, we want to reach the people that we haven't reached. That's the challenge. So all of which leads to, and if you hear me getting fired up on this whole topic, it's because this has been the driving force, I think, for 30 years in the journey I've been on, which was way back when I was a graduate student in marine biology. I began watching these documentaries and realizing most of them are made for their inner circle. They're preaching to the choir. They're all about, we're losing the resources, but the voice and the style and everything about them makes you realize they're being made for these privileged people to share among themselves and not really reaching into the offenders. That's the challenge. Can you really reach across the aisle into the people that are damaging the resource? And so I learned back then this phrase, preaching to the converted or preaching to the choir. And now I've advanced enough in what I've learned to be able to kind of, reword that as preaching to the and, your inner circle. So that's what we're talking about here. So in this context, here's what happened. This is the backstory on how Chapman ended up being a guest with us today. 3 years ago, I was invited to join a post-screening panel discussion for this documentary feature film right when it came out, Chasing Coral, at a local aquarium in Los Angeles. A friend invited me. And I watched about 15 minutes of it. It just appeared on Netflix. And after 15 minutes, I shut it off and wrote back to my friend and said, you don't want me there. I don't like this film. This is not the style of filmmaking that I am supportive of. And it's an and film. It's a film for that inner circle. And you're going to have an event with 200 people that are all ocean lovers, all in a theater. They're going to love it. We're going to get to the end of it. The lights are going to go on. Everybody's going to be smiling. And then you're going to have me come out on the stage and I'm going to say, that was terrible. And everybody's going to hate me. So don't want me there to do that. And yet about 2 weeks later, I turn on HBO Real Sports. Before I say anything about that, why is it that I wasn't a fan of this movie? Because from the very outset, from the very beginning, you could feel it. And it's so relevant to what Park and Diana went through on Wednesday, which is that whole thing that Park said to start with about the mistake small companies make is they cast themselves as the hero, when in fact, what you want to do is cast the customer as the hero. And you're just there as the mentor or guide. That fundamental divide is what I'm talking about here. And you could see it from this is the very first line in this documentary. It's the main guy who's the superhero out there trying to save coral reefs for our planet. And he begins by saying, I've always been drawn to the magic of the ocean. It's all about him. He is the hero in the journey in this movie. Now, in contrast, as I said, 2 weeks later, this segment came on Real Sports. And I love that show, have for 15, 20 years. And so I watch every segment. And this one began with Bryant Gumbel going to the Great Barrier Reef. It was 12 minutes long. And his first line is he says, to millions of sport divers, this is paradise. So you can see it in that first line. He's already talking about the millions of sport divers, not about himself and about how he grew up and this, that, and the thing, trying to save coral reefs. And the whole thing, as you've already heard, you've seen, and the way I broke it down, I thought just matched all the principles that I believe in. So I ended up writing that blog post and putting on my blog, and I usually accept that next to nobody reads what I put out there. Long ago, I got rid of comments on my blog. I don't really want everybody hashing back and forth on things. It's more of a stockpile place for me to stockpile material that I ended up using for the books that I write. So I threw it out there and then forgot about it. And 2 weeks later, this email pops up from this guy from HBO Real Sports. And I look at it and go, oh, wow, that name, I recognize that. It's Chapman Downs, the producer of the segment. And what he said in his little email was that he was on vacation with his wife and somebody forwarded this blog post to her, and they were sitting by the pool and she read it aloud to him. And of course, the whole thing is just a complete rave of this just being the very best journalistic skills at work. You can see from the top there, professionals at work. So I'm sure it was fun to him to listen to. He sent his innocent email. And of course, anybody writes to me like that, next thing you know, I turned into a stalker, started chasing him with emails and phone calls. Eventually had lunch with him in New York City and they're at HBO studios. And we've been buddies ever since because I'm such a fan of this show and it embodies all the principles that we're talking about. So now, just let me give you quickly this little overview thing, again, to hit home this point, and then we're going to have tons of time to talk. So in the last round of this course, we had a fellow named Marty Kaplan, who was the founder of something called Hollywood Health and Society. And that's a project that, again, follows this model that Park and Diana talked about. They don't try and be the heroes themselves. They work as mentors. So in the health world, I go to film festivals and you see all these well-intended documentaries being made by people who just don't know how to tell a good story. And it's really easy to make a documentary, you just glue together a bunch of footage, but it won't have any impact if it doesn't follow these narrative rules. Instead, what they do with Hollywood Health and Society is they take the public health fact sheets from the Centers for Disease Control and distribute them to all the writers of primetime TV shows in Hollywood every month. And then they work with those writers. So they yield to the professionals who know how to do the storytelling, and they just try and help them get the science be accurate. And it's a tremendous program. It's been going for 20 some years. I've done some stuff with them, and they have about 15 people now working there, working to make the science more accurate in mainstream television programming. The climate world also fell into this mistake. This is a whole separate hour I could spend on it. I've written it extensively in my books. Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, was an and piece that was hastily put together in the fall of 2005, had virtually no solid narrative structure to it, and as a result, played to the inner circle. And yes, it made $25 million in box office, but John Krosnick, pollster from Stanford, told me they went out and did these surveys, and you could see the people that turned out for the movie were all the converted environmentalists. It didn't cross over the aisle. In contrast, there was a movie made, a big action feature, The Day After Tomorrow with Dennis Quaid, which was cockamamie. The science in it was terrible. And in the last round of this course, we had Gavin Schmidt, the head of the Goddard NASA Center at Columbia University. He came and talked to us, and he told about that. And when that came out, he and 7 or 8 of their top climate scientists all went to a local movie theater and watched it. And they all sat there with their arms folded as the audience cheered and loved the movie. But the science in it was cockamamie. But Tony Lazarowitz at Yale showed that movie actually did cross the aisle because of the action adventure stuff. And it conveyed one factoid back in 2004 when it came out, which is the idea that we could actually alter the atmosphere. And it's hard for people to remember this now, 16 years ago. But back then, it was kind of semi-laughable, the idea that the atmosphere is so vast we could never do anything to alter it. That movie helped move the needle on that a little bit, more so than the Al Gore movie did, sad to say, but that's a whole long other discussion. And now we're talking about here this fundamental divide between these two movies. So again, media that reaches only the inner group versus media that does reach the outer group. We're bringing Chapman here today with us because he's an expert in how they do that and their demographic with Real Sports, which is definitely the outer group. And this was the breakdown that we did. So on that note and that introduction, Chapman, can you join us? And you and I will talk for, about 10 minutes or so here, and then we'll have people start asking questions. And I want to hit the ground running here with a simple thing that I brought up with you yesterday, because it dives right into what we work on here. And, we're not here to talk about coral reefs, the content. We're here to talk about the form, how you pull this together. And what I asked you yesterday in that breakdown I did I showed how your whole segment was 12 minutes. You had 3 minutes of what we call the ordinary world. That's just all happy, fun, love, wonderful coral reefs. And then right at 3 minutes, you turned it into, but here's a problem. Now, my question for you is, why 3 minutes? Why not 2 minutes? Why not 4 minutes?
Let me just also start by thanking you, Randy, for all the kind words, and to all of your students for having me. If I ramble too long, please interject. There's no, I was telling Randy yesterday, when we, and 20 years ago when I started at Real Sports, I knew nothing about narrative. And I've just been very, very lucky to be around people who have taught me how to do long form storytelling and simplifying the complex. And so to answer your question, though, it's really a feel thing, right? You want to start off, at least with this story, we wanted to start off by establishing what the Great Barrier Reef is, showing its beauty, its size, how unique it is, how it's unlike any other place in the world, so that the viewer, not the, as you call it, the inner group, but the outer group, people who know nothing about the Great Barrier Reef, my grandmother sitting at home, my mom sitting at home on her couch, will be captivated, right? And the images are incredibly powerful. They're beautiful. And then after you've done that, and sometimes it can go on a little bit too long. My boss, who is our editor, or we do a peer review about 4 or 5 days into our edit, where we show the rest of the staff the piece. Sometimes it will be a little bit too long, and they'll say you can tighten it up at the top. But it's really a feel thing. I don't write the script saying, oh, it's at 3 minutes. It's kind of a feel thing. Do we have enough? But you also, as I think Randy's kind of getting to, you don't want to wait too long, because you want to get you want to introduce the idea of tension, right? And so we did that about 3 minutes. Randy timed it out. I didn't even know that. But I guess the answer to your question is it's a feel thing. Yeah. And so after we have Bryant go out on the reef with Dean Miller, the marine biologist, and see the beautiful areas of the reef and establish it. And for us, we need to, we establish that there's some kind of sports connection. It's obviously a story that's much bigger than sports, right? We try to do that on our show, find issues that have some kind of a sports tie. This is a story about climate change and the destruction of one of the great wonders of the world, not a sports story. But we try to do, we want to get to the tension. And so after Bryant and Dean are out there, we say there's just one very big problem, right? And I wrote it down. Places like this are getting harder to find because the Great Barrier Reef is dying, is essentially what we said. So I don't know if I went on too long.
No. Okay. So yeah, now I want to dig in. So paint a picture for us. Tell us about the experience that you were telling me about yesterday, which can be ruthless sometimes, of you having to take this cut into this group of people that you're going to share it with, and what goes on there, and tell us a little bit about that part, because everybody listening, this is the same basic thing you're doing with working circles. You're accepting that you sitting alone at your desk is not good enough. You've got to get these other eyes and ears in there as well. So can you tell us about that experience, week out or month after month?
Yes. We do it on every piece. Every piece we do a thing called what we call a peer review, where after we have gone, so we write the script, we pour through everything, right? All the transcripts, everything. Once we're done shooting, back at our studios in New York, back at our offices in New York, then I'll write a script, send it to my boss. We'll have a bunch of revisions. Then we go into the edit room. Once we're in the edit room for 3 or 4 days, usually about 4 days, we put a rough cut together. And then we will do what we call a peer review, and where we play the rough cut. And you want the rough cut to be in pretty good shape, because the hope is, and I've been doing this now for 20 years, the hope is that everybody's going to love it, right? And when I was listening to you guys earlier pitch Randy, and he's giving you feedback, I could totally feel, not feel your pain, but it sometimes can be hard to get feedback. Well, we have 16, 17 of my colleagues in these peer reviews, And the peer reviews are not to sit there and tell you everything is hunky-dory and it's great. And it's a very brutal process. Everybody is very honest, and but it always makes the piece better. It always makes the piece better. And at the end of the day, that's all you want, right? And so I will get consensus. I will sit there and take notes. I will try to figure out, I will listen to what they're saying, and I will go and usually, hopefully, you don't have to make major structural changes, although that sometimes happens. But
what's the worst?
Go back.
What's the worst experience you've had like that?
That's a good question. I just had an experience last month. It wasn't bad, but I started off doing a story about a convicted felon who spent 27 years in jail for a crime he did not commit. And I spent too much time kind of relitigating the case rather than focusing on the thing that helped get him out. And basically this guy, his name is Valentino Dixon, he was a great artist when he was a young kid, and he abandoned that and fell prey to the streets and became a drug dealer. And he ended up going to jail for a murder that he didn't commit. And when he was in prison, he rediscovered his love of art and started drawing. And one day the prison warden came to him and said, he caught wind of the fact that Dixon was this great artist, drawer. And he said, I'd like you to draw me the 12th hole at Augusta, because the guy was Augusta National Golf Course where the Masters is played. And the warden was a big golfer. So he did this, and he loved the way it made him feel. It took him out of the dark, dank, depressing, colorless life of prison and transported him to a place of beauty, right, of serenity. And so he ended up, long story short, he ended up writing, he wrote to an editor of Golf Digest magazine what these drawings were doing for him, because that's all he did, 15 hours a day, every day, all year long. And he drew hundreds and hundreds of golf courses. And anyway, this guy ended up, one of the reporters from Golf Digest started looking into his case, and it ultimately helped free him. And anyway, the feedback from the peer review was they wanted to see more art, a lot more art up top, more art throughout the piece. And it really, really helped make the story much better. And that always happens.
That's really interesting, because it was a tremendous segment. It was on this past month's episode. And I every time I watch the show now, especially if there's an episode that Chapman's produced, I send him an email with my thoughts on it. And that was incredible. The artwork is beyond belief. Then I went to the guy's website, and clearly he's doing real well. Those things are not cheap now, his paintings, but they're worth it. I mean, I want to get one. They're spectacular. And let's see. So getting back to the Great Barrier Reef segment, and we'll do another 2 or 3 minutes, and we'll start questions. Okay, so that's how you opened it. Somebody asked in our discussion yesterday, why didn't you end the whole thing with how everybody should get out there and get active, and here's all the things you can do to save coral reefs, the world, and a whole big activist agenda? Why didn't your segment end with that?
Well, I thought, for the simple answer is we're not activists, right? We're journalists. And we try to balance these pieces out. In the beginning, we had Dean Miller, who was a marine biologist from Australia, and then we had Dr. Charlie Varon. And then we brought in somebody from the tourism industry who was sitting there saying, well, yes, okay, there's a problem, but there's still plenty of good reef left, okay? And then that's part of the problem, right? But the bigger problem is that the reef is being betrayed by its own country, right? Because of their position on coal and the fact that they export more coal than any country on Earth, okay? And so, our job is to present a fair story and let the viewer decide what their takeaway is. I thought Varon argued his case very well. I thought Miller did too. there are a lot of people, and most people wouldn't agree with Canavan, the politician from Queensland. But there are people who do. There are people who do believe, would look at that and say, you know what, coal does provide jobs, and I agree with that. So,
and I think specifically on your demographic, that's the problem there, is that you've got a very broad, way outer group there. And if you suddenly produced a whole big activist environmental piece, you'd chase away a lot of the NFL fans and things you got like that. So you're managing to communicate a small amount of environmental message to a very broad and diverse audience, reaching way out there, as opposed to these intergroup things that have got the entire message, but then nobody from the other side is going to even watch them. So I think it's important for everybody to know that demographic.
Yeah, but I don't think it's, I don't go into these stories thinking about that. I go into these stories thinking about what's fair. You want to give the other side why is this happening?
Yeah.
I don't sit there and say, we should have, it's also, you also want, without that other side, there's really not that third act. If we have another environmentalist there for the third act, it's like, it's just kind of redundant to what the previous two characters are telling you.
Yeah.
If there's, and so I think it's more about just trying to present both sides, and I think the takeaway, and letting the viewers have their own opinion.
Okay. Liz or Mike, you got some questions, some people to call on for questions.
Yeah, Dana has a question.
Dana's got 7 questions at least. Go ahead and activate your camera and microphone to jump in there, and go for it, Dana.
Hi, Chairman. Thank you very much for speaking to us today. This is wonderful. Well, a couple questions, but one, I was just wondering, in your words, how you define your audience and what you learned from them, maybe that you didn't think of them before. And also, I was just also wondering, when you're talking about kind of, storytelling versus educating versus maybe activism, do you ever want your audience to do something at the end? And I know it depends on the story, but with elephant poaching for coral reefs, do you ever want to leave them something for them to want to participate or help or take action?
That's a good question.
Let me ask you in some of the public, you've got some public health issues that you've addressed, and the concussion issue and diseases and things like that. Do you ever end those with a plea to the public to give to a fund or something?
I don't think there's any kind of plea to the public. I think that if we try to do stories where there are, as far as our viewers, each show we try to have, we don't always succeed at this, but we try to have usually a profile, usually an investigative piece, usually maybe an issues-oriented piece, right? It's a magazine show, so we try to have some variety. It's sometimes if an investigative piece needs more time, we won't have an investigative piece. But that's kind of always the goal for the viewers, to provide them options. As far as trying to, camel jockeys is a good example. A colleague did a story about how little kids in the Middle East were being kidnapped and taken from very poor areas like Bangladesh and brought to the UAE to serve as camel jockeys, because camel racing is very, very big over there. And it was basically modern day slavery. And my colleague, who now runs the show, did an incredible piece of journalism. And it ended up being seen by one of the prince's family members, who was so horrified that thousands and thousands of kids are enslaved, sexually molested. Some even died, falling off the camels and being trampled. And so it did the family member saw it, and it led to them stopping this. They now use mechanical jockeys. And so we revisited that story. We updated it, and it was, I think it was probably the best piece in the history of the show. It led to change. And I don't know if we get into, I mean, we try to expose wrongdoing or we think, we try to investigate stories that we think there is some kind of wrongdoing. Now, I don't know if I sit there and I'm saying, you know what, I'm doing this to, I'm really, really hoping that something good comes of this. I'm glad when it does, but I'm not really thinking about that during the process.
Well,
I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, let me give a summary statement on that. We'll move on to the next question. So thanks, Dana. The core principle in filmmaking is don't tell us, show us. And I think that's what you're embodying there. You don't make a segment that tells about how bad something is. You show it. And by showing it so powerfully, you end up having results out there in the real world. But it doesn't happen by preaching to people. It happens by showing what's going on, and that catalyzes things. I think
that was a much more succinct way of saying what I was trying to say. Thank you, Randy.
And that's for everybody to soak in. That's the core principle of everything. Don't tell us, show us. Peter Sale, you want to jump in and ask a question?
Yeah, sure. First of all, Chapman, I'm really enjoying the getting into the details of this Great Barrier Reef segment you did. And I'm quite fascinated by it. And the question I have for you is, when you conceived of producing this particular segment, did you know about the extent to which the dive community, the commercial dive community, or sport dive community around the world has been very reticent to say anything about climate change? It's sort of a taboo subject to many of them. Were you aware of that when you began your decision to make this piece, and did that motivate you to do it?
And by the way, let me add one thing before you start there. Peter Sale is one of the greatest fish biologists in the history of the Great Barrier Reef. He spent his entire career working on community dynamics of coral reef fish there. So he has a lot of experience with the resource itself. So yeah, take it away, Chapman.
Well, thanks, Peter, for that. I mean, so, we started looking into it because it was making a lot of news right after the second bleaching. It was on the front page of the New York Times, I think Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. I mean, there was a lot that was being written about it. And we thought this would be a great, as I kind of mentioned earlier, what's the sports connection for us, sport diving? And so I'm not sure that I think we did when, we cast a wide net trying to cast the piece. And I certainly knew from talking to some divers that, hey, there are a lot of people down here that this is very, they don't want to acknowledge the problem. If they do acknowledge it, they don't want to sit there and advertise it to the world, because a lot of people felt like that guy from the tourism industry felt. Yeah, you know what? There's some damage, but there's still a lot of good reef. And if we tell everybody it's as bad as it is, nobody's going to be coming down here anymore. And that's what really bothered Varon, Dr. Varon. He was, and still is very frustrated with the tourism industry, because he thinks they're contributing to the problem to a much lesser degree than obviously the government and the government's policy on coal. And, as it's happened again, right? It just happened again. And so we're, right now I'm looking into trying to do a climate change piece, including some other sports, skiing, ice climbing, and also including in that an update after what just happened in Australia with the latest round of bleaching.
Great. Okay, let's see. Liz, you got somebody with a question? Yes, go for it, Liz.
Stephen Miller has a question about the process. Stephen, can you activate?
Hello, thanks for doing this. So I have a two-part question. The first part is, for a 12-minute piece like this, how many hours of film do you take to put it together? And relatively speaking, was this an easy or a difficult piece to edit and tell the story?
I heard your first one. What was the second part?
The second part was relatively speaking, was this an easy or difficult piece to put together?
Good question. I find at this point, certainly some are easy. I find that they're all really, really challenging. Fun, but they're all really challenging, right? Like, how do we make sure that we cast the right characters, right? And I'll get to your second question, but we always talk about characters, action, narrative. Okay, it's a little thing that my boss, who hired me 20 years ago, taught me. If you have all three of those, right, and he called it CAN, characters, action, and narrative, you should have a really good story. And in this piece, I think we did. But we cast a wide net. I probably talked to 25, 30 people to figure out who we should interview, at least, maybe more. And I thought all of the characters were good on camera. We had action, meaning access. We were down there. We were out on the reef. We were in beautiful parts. We were in dead parts. And then narrative. Obviously, there's a very powerful narrative. And then as far as how many hours shot, the interviews usually go about 2 hours each. With the tourism guy, it didn't. It was about 10 or 15 minutes. Canavan was a little bit shorter. The politician, he was probably about an hour. But Varon and Miller were closer to 2 hours, and then we shot their main interviews. But then we spent, to get out to the reef, we spent a couple of days out there doing interviews in multiple places. We did interviews with Varon under the water. We did interviews up top on the boat, out in the Zodiac with Miller. So I don't know exactly how many hours, but we shoot tons and tons. Probably too much, but I'd always rather overshoot than undershoot. And then we license, everything that we haven't been able to get. We can license certain video. We can license footage of CO2 being put into the atmosphere, that kind of stuff.
I think it's really interesting that the scientists took a couple hours to give you material for for the story, and the politician and the business guy just a few minutes, because they knew what their take-home message was.
Well, but I thought Varon, and you guys can tell me what you thought. I thought those guys did a really good job of.
I'll say something on that.
Simplifying complex issues. I thought they were very good at that.
As a matter of fact, you kind of hit a bullseye with Charlie Varon. You picked just the right guy. He really is the godfather of the Great Barrier Reef. And sometimes you see these segments and you see some scientist on there, like a junior person, like, why is that person the focus of this whole thing? But with Charlie, he's really tremendous. Let's see. Liz, you got another question, somebody?
Randy, I have one. Lyndon asked, it must be challenging and a difficult balancing act for creating a segment that captures activism, dispassionate science.
Okay, hang on, wait a second. Let's have him ask it. Lynn, you there? You want to? So this is my old buddy Lynn Devantier, who lives in New Zealand and was a postdoc with me years ago on the Great Barrier Reef back in the good old days. Lynn, you with us? Can you activate your camera? Who's here earlier? And he's actually spent years working with Charlie Varon. So, Lynn, give us a few thoughts on the reef and how it's doing.
Yeah, greetings all. Thanks very much, Chapman. Fascinating. And the show was terrific, I have to say. I just wondered how tricky it is to be able to manage all of those.
Hey, Lynn,
how challenging it is to be able to create.
Lynn, can you mute your video? So you're breaking up a little bit. If you mute your video, we'll get your audio clear, probably.
Mute the video. I'm not sure how to mute the video. Randy.
Stop video button at the bottom of the screen.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, go for it now.
Okay. Yeah, it must be a challenging and difficult balancing act to be able to capture that activism aspect of it, and not have the scientists becoming too much of an activist, to maintain that dispassionate aspect of it on the one hand, with the tourist diving industry and political expediency on the other. I mean, it was very clear in your show with Canavan how he was able to just pretty much dismiss, the whole of the scientific arguments, and helped to a degree by the tourism industry. And I think it was really important that you were able to show these different sides. So it wasn't just preaching to the converted. You gave everybody a chance, but the overall message, I think, came through quite clearly that, some people were speaking from experience and the truth of the matter, and others were just doing the expedient thing for their back pockets.
Hey, Lynn, can you give us an update? You're telling me about nowadays what Charlie's involved with the multiple aquariums as kind of refugia. What was that about?
Well, yeah, Charlie and many others, of course, are extremely concerned about the future for corals more generally. So there's a project that he's, I think, trying to get off the ground at the moment, a coral ark, which is to maintain as many of the 850 odd species of reef builders in aquaria, so that they could be used later in restoring reefs. It's a fairly desperate measure, and it's just getting off the ground. But as you'll be aware, there are populations of corals that have been maintained for decades in aquaria globally. I'm still of the view, I'm still hopeful enough that the natural processes and our slowly awakening political pressures may yet keep some reefs going, but the barrier reef is in a really bad shape. And it, as you know, it mostly sits on a very shallow continental shelf, easily heated. It has major river systems that dump a lot of pollutants into it. It's got crown-of-thorn starfish still rampaging up and down it, which is what Randy and I started off studying way back when. And I think Peter Sale was involved with that work as well back in the day.
For sure. And Lynn, have you got one short question for Chapman?
You're throwing it at me now.
Or not. Don't worry about it.
I'd love to hear a bit more about the CAN aspect. That acronym that you threw up, Chapman, that was a fascinating point to me. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, and thanks for all the kind words. And CAN, characters, action, narrative. And look, sometimes if you're doing an investigative piece and the person who is that you're interviewing that's in the hot seat or you think is the responsible party is not a great character, there's not really anything that you can do. You can't cast another person. So sometimes, and if that person's not a great character, there's nothing you can do. But the point is, if you have when in a story like this, and in a lot of our stories, it's very important to find people who are passionate about or who are good on camera, can explain simply, can simplify complex issues like I think Varen did and like Miller did. Because, if you find somebody who's really dry and might care but doesn't come across as caring, the viewer's not going to care and you're going to lose the viewer. And, I talk to people who are in print, and it's interesting. They don't really care about whether or not the person's a good character or not, because they can bring the person alive with their words. You can't do that on television, right? You can't do that on long-form news magazine storytelling. The person has to be able to tell their story. And so as far as characters go, that's incredibly important. Access, action, can you be there? I mean, can you imagine if we had to do this story now via Zoom with Gumbel here in New York and not out on the reef, doing this all, it just wouldn't be the same, It wouldn't be nearly as good as being out there, as they're about to go jump on, go swimming in the reef,
Okay,
that's cool, right?
We got time for one more question. Then I've got two last little points to make here. We're just about out of time. This always blows by so fast. But Mike Strauss, did you have somebody with one last quick question?
It's Liz, and yes, we had Angelique with a question.
Go for it, Angelique.
Hi, I really enjoyed that clip. I thought it was great that it was so dispassionate, and I wondered how did you get the politician especially to come on and speak? I mean, I try and get like fishers to come and speak, and the fishers know that, I might be attacking them because they're taking too many fish. So they're already in a defensive position. How did you approach that politician to get him to speak, really?
We reached out to his office and he was willing. And I don't know if it's sometimes because it's, HBO and we're coming down there to do a story. And he had been very outspoken about it. There were other politicians too. But he was going to be in the area. It felt fair to have him as kind of a responsible party since he was so for this, for pro-coal. So pro-coal. And so, yeah, I mean, and the first, Varon and Miller went well, and Canavan was the last part of the story, and we did him down in Townsville. Yeah, we did him down in Townsville, and I was nervous all week because, you never know if something's going to come up, if he's going to decide, you know what, I don't want to do it, or if he gets dragged away and can't do it, and then we have to go back to the States. What are we going to do? Because that's an important third act. And while a lot of people might not like him, I thought having him and hearing that strengthened the piece a lot, right? Because off of him, you can go to Dean Miller, and Dean Miller says, it just seems crazy that at a time when we're losing the Great Barrier Reef, we're doubling down with the Carmichael mine, I mean, what are we doing?
And speaking of third acts, we unfortunately have to wrap up our third act here. So I've got two last little points I want to make. One of which, right at the beginning when I first met Chapman, one of my first questions to him was, I always, in these years of watching this show, assumed they had this global network of 280 people out there scouring the planet looking for these amazing stories that they end up producing. And much to my shock and horror, he burst that bubble and said, the first thing he said was, we're actually a surprisingly small team. And what they do have is a group of long-term producers who have this magical thing that we're preaching about in this course here of narrative intuition. They have such a good intuitive feel for story that they're able to just look, at the news and spot something that looks like a good story. Their instincts drive them in there, and they've got that ability to shape the story. And again, that's why this whole course is about trying to get yourself on a course of building narrative intuition, because it's a long process, but the payoff is eventually your ability to spot these things and shape them quickly and have them really work like that. And the last little tidbit I want to say was from last spring, right when the pandemic started. One of the first episodes, Bryant Gumbel was sitting there in his living room, and he's got his bookshelf behind him. And my jaw dropped as I spotted the spine of one of the books on his bookshelf. It was Michael Crichton's anti-environmental screed, State of Fear. And I zoomed in on it. I took a picture and zoomed in. Oh my God, it's that book. So I sent him an email, and the next week or the next month, it was not on his bookshelf. I think he said Bryant was kind of horrified to realize that was a.
Well, I told him, he just said it was a prop, and I told him. He said I never read it, and I told him, and he said, "Oh my God," and he went and burned it right away.
Exactly, it is a bad book. I wish we had another half an hour to keep going on this, but thank you so much, Chapman. This is really, really great. Really appreciate it, and you've made a whole bunch more fans for the show.
I really appreciate it. I appreciate it, Randy, and thanks for all the kind words. And thank you all for having me. And good luck. And if you ever want to email, or if you have any questions, Randy, pass along my email. But good luck, you guys.
Thank you so much, Chapman. And we will see all of you folks on Monday. Have a great weekend. Adios.